Grace and Peace. I'm Brian Musser, and I am the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University. And this is Peace and Power, a Bible study, the peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world around us. And we are continuing our series in worship, putting work back into worship. And this is our week 6 of the content. And this week we'll be talking about work-rest balance. But really, for this first video of week 6, we're going to review several of the points we made earlier. The first one is this is our definition of work. Work is the intentional use of a person's energy, mental, physical, emotional, and or spiritual, to accomplish a specific and valuable change. And we developed that definition because we came to the conclusion that God works, and therefore our definition of work has to be something that God would be able to do. Now, worship, the basic concept behind worship is that we can put on display the image of God as we work like God works. And from last time, this includes working together like the Trinity works together. This deepens our understanding of who God is and explains God to those around us, functioning much like a parable. Therefore, our work can draw us and others into worship. And then we spent 3 weeks looking at how the Trinity works together, but we separated out. We talked about God the Father creates and sustains, God the Son redeems and communicates, God the Holy Spirit convicts and empowers, and then last week we specifically looked at the fact that they all work together, and when we work together, we can look like God as well. So getting into this week's content, work, rest, balance. And I have a work parable. We'll start off with the parable this time. And allow me to talk about Ralph with you for a little bit. Ralph is 67 years old. He is considering retirement for several years. Ralph worked for one company for the last 30 years and has consistently moved up in the business. He is a dying breed that have been faithful to one company, and this company has been faithful to him. But now his employer is interested in his retirement. Anytime the conversation of retirement comes up, Ralph has mixed emotions. His job has given him a sense of purpose. He has felt valuable, and it is part of his identity. Ralph is tired. He has gotten up early every morning for what seems like 45 years. He has worked long hours. He can't do all the things he used to. He likes the idea of a break, but does it have to be complete and permanent? Ralph would love to take a couple months off and then come back on a limited basis as something like a consultant. He doesn't want to do the heavy lifting, but he doesn't want to be completely irrelevant. These feelings are why he has lingered at his job. If he had something important to do other than work, he would have left a couple years ago. But he has stayed long enough to start sensing that some of his colleagues no longer want him. He would like to retire on his own prerogative, but if he doesn't do it soon, he will be asked to leave. Plus, he can sense all those under him wondering when his position will be available. So as we look at rest, we're not just going to be looking at the idea of, resting on the weekend or resting at night, but this idea of how rest interplays with work and how work and rest communicate together. And retirement, that is kind of part of the idea. And I thought this story would bring out some of those interesting points about work-rest balance that we don't always get to. But what advice would you give Ralph? Think through. Should he retire? Should he find something? How does he engage the idea that work is a part of his identity? And thinking for you, do you want to retire as soon as possible? Why or why not? Are you just looking for that way to get out of working and have as much free time as possible? Or do you want to work as long as you can? Are you imagining a lifelong of work, or someplace in between? How does rest and work interplay? Rest. Let's talk about rest for a little bit. Starting with Genesis 2 through 3. By the seventh day, God completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from his work of creation. thinking through this, um, and if you remember from a previous lesson, we dealt with the question of how could God work? And we defined our definition, which you saw previously, based on the idea that God is perfectly fine introducing himself to us as a God who works. So therefore, our definition of work must be based on that. But again, in these verses, we see a God who rests. So now our definition of work and our definition of rest have to be connected with who God is and what God does. God rests. And in those verses that we just saw, we saw a God who rests in a way that declares that day he rests on holy. God resting is a good thing. Now, did God need to rest? Not really. God doesn't need to do anything. Was God so tired that he had to rest? No. God's work was done, so the most appropriate thing for God to do at that moment, or technically not do, was to rest. Therefore, we have to think that rest is in and of itself intrinsically good. It is good to rest, and rest is good. But we also see that rest came after God's work. So for some reason, rest is inherently and intimately connected to work. We work and we rest. Now, rest in this idea helps us deal with a significant and important spiritual question. And that question is, am I valuable? As we've talked about several times, theologians divide the image of God in humanity into three categories: into reason, something about me, something about a human being is like God. And quite often we talk about a human being's ability to make a decision, ability to choose, ability to have a rational choice. Or regency. We look like God when we do those things God has assigned us, and we rule the creation that God has set us over. Or as we saw last week in relationship, the God of the universe is a triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who relate to each other. When we relate to others, whether that's God or other humans, we look like God in those relationships. Now, rest really looks at this idea of, do we still have the image of God in us when we aren't fulfilling the regency, when we aren't ruling, when we aren't working hard in what we do? And we can look at this two ways. When we rest, does that mean we aren't in the image of God? We aren't displaying the image of God anymore? And if we have some sort of disability that prevents us from working, does that necessarily diminish the image of God in us? Hopefully, you answer no to both of those things. I am valuable, and to have a good work rest balance, we have to establish our value outside of just accomplishing things, just doing things. Establishing your intrinsic value based on who you are in God's eyes and based on the image of God in you, independent of your work-based achievement, is necessary for proper work rest balance. Work allows you to display the image of God, but it is not the entirety of the image of God in you. And rest, since God rests, rest would also allow you to display the image of God as well. As we look at this, we can display the image of God in us as we rest because God rested. We can look like a God who rests when we rest. So not only can we display the image of God in work, not only can we display the image of God as we work together, but we can display the image of God when we rest. So some discussion questions for you to think about. If you have any answers, drop them down in the comments below. When you are taking a break, what are you thinking? Do you have an internal conversation defending your inaction? Do you have to make up excuses or reasons for why you are resting? If you answer to these questions in the affirmative, why do you think that is? And then just sort of to think through what type of activity or inactivity do you find to be restful. I enjoyed having these conversations with you, and you can always join in two ways: live Monday nights to have a back and forth banter about these topics. It's at 7 p.m. via Zoom, and you can find those links in the description below, or these weekly wrap-ups either on YouTube or the WordPress blog. As always, I am all over social media: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Those links are in the description. I enjoyed talking to you and hope to continue this conversation real soon.